There's a unique sequence of attributes that represent your digital DNA, your unique you. But it's supposed to be anonymous. But it's anonymous only until someone figure out how to de-anonymize it. And there were plenty of studies over time, like the famous one using just the zip code and a few. I think it was just 3 attributes was sufficient for, and so on and so on. More recently, Mozilla demonstrated that using your browsing history alone was sufficient to re-identify you. I think 15 attributes are sufficient to identify 99.98% of the people. Just 15 attributes.
Welcome to Endless Coffee Cup, a regular discussion of marketing news, culture, and media for our complex digital lifestyle. Join Matt Bailey as he engages in conversation to find insights beyond the latest headlines and deeper understanding for those involved in marketing. Grab a cup of coffee, have a seat, and thanks for joining.
Well, hello and welcome, listeners, to another edition of the Endless Coffee Cup podcast. And today we are going to be focusing on data, analytics, and privacy. And because of that, I have asked Stéphane Hamel to be a part of this. And if you follow Stéphane on LinkedIn, you'll know that he's been very outspoken about data and privacy. And so, Stéphane, welcome, and thank you so much for being on today's episode.
Thank you for having me, Matt. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, Stéphane, could you take a few moments and just introduce us a little bit to yourself and,
For sure.
And what you've done in the industry?
Yeah, well, it depends how long you have. But
That's why you're here.
Yeah, but seriously, I think I was really, really lucky when I did my internship in computer science in 1987. So that goes pretty far back. I worked on an obscure little project, but they had access to the internet.
Oh, wow.
Back in those days. And that project was about using healthcare data or health-related data that was anonymized to understand patient behavior and how much care they needed and stuff like that. So it working with data goes all the way through my first internship. And I was lucky to have access to the internet. Of course, at the time, there was no web. There were
Right.
FTP, chat, email, file transfer through FTP, of course. I think news groups existed at the time. So it was
Right,
really
yes.
research, academic, very interesting community. And it was I was working on a Unix computer and C programming. So that goes pretty far.
Wow.
So when the web came out, it was natural for me. I was working on another project that involved 40 years of data for Hydro-Quebec, which is the main supplier of electricity. So a lot of data. In fact, we had to split. It was big data before the time because it was so big that we had to split into multiple Oracle instance. In that role, I was lucky again to have access to the internet. So when the web came out, it was natural for me. I was a system administrator, DBA administrator, so it was natural for me to install a web server, and then up you go. You have log files. You started looking at log files, and then my career took a shift into web development, digital marketing, and so on. So now, over the past several years, I've done consulting, teaching, speaking at conferences, creating tools that were useful for the market, sharing concepts like the digital analytics maturity model, and so on. So, closely involved with the industry, creating, sharing, learning all the time.
Great. And I think you and I sort of became partners through Simply Learn.
Exactly.
In developing content for them as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the reasons why I wanted to contact you is because, like I said, you've been very outspoken about data and privacy. Before we even get into that, I've just noticed that online, the people that tend to be the most outspoken about data and data privacy are people who have their foundation in analytics.
Hmm.
And I'm just trying to piece together, why is that? Is it because like you said, when we saw log files back, 20 years ago, I was amazed at how much data was in there. And it's all traced to an IP address. And maybe that's it, but I'd be very curious to hear what your thoughts are.
I think there's probably two different factors. One is the engineering background. So, working in computer science and so on, you have that sensibility or awareness of the usefulness of data and how powerful it can be it for optimizing marketing campaigns or understanding business processes and optimizing those business processes online or offline. So there's this desire to understand, solve, and optimize all the
Mm.
time, right? Uh, the other aspect, I guess, at least for me, is during my long career, at one point, I was a hacker. And I guess a lot of people were at some point to different degrees, but I was doing stuff that was probably not correct at the time. But eventually it was also a learning, a challenge, because there's always an interesting side to hacking, which is trying to find the problem that you can exploit, or
Mm.
trying to understand what are the issues and fix them. So there was that, from the initial idea of trying to find the loophole, then you move on and you say, okay, yes, I can solve that. And in fact, this is even more rewarding and much more interesting than simply exploiting. So I guess there's this sensibility about the data, of knowing that data can be exploited in ways that we don't always imagine,
Mm.
but someone else will figure it out and they will exploit it if you don't. So I guess there's part of this awareness, really.
That is a great, great point that, yeah, you may not do it, but someone else will. Now, was that the moment, or was there another moment that made you decide to become much more active and vocal about data and privacy?
Yeah. Well, the simple answer is through my consulting, and I've coached agencies. I've not talked about that a lot, because typically agencies were hiring me to help them develop or further improve their own analytics practice so they could sell services to their own clients.
Okay.
So typically those agencies, they wanted to keep that relationship more low profile, because they want to show that they know what they're doing and so on, which is perfectly fine. So I was coaching agencies, working with my own clients, speaking obviously with a lot of people in the industry. And I realized how, in many cases, the data was being used in ways that were either illegal
Mm.
or unethical. So that is one point. But the two other big points are, I did a live Q&A, a live interview with Christopher Wiley at a conference in Europe. And in order to get ready for that, Christopher Wiley is the whistleblower of Cambridge Analytica.
Yes.
So in order to get ready for that, I watched and I read so much information about this whole thing that everybody heard about it, everybody knows about it, but to which degree? So I spent
Right.
a lot of time looking into that, and then I spent 45 minutes alone with Christopher Wiley before going on stage, and the
Mm.
discussion I had was just fascinating. It was life changing, I would say, for me in my career. And then the third point is, my data was leaked,
Mm.
along with maybe 8 million other people from a financial institution. And guess what? It was leaked by someone working in marketing.
Mm.
So that was the kind of the cherry on the top. And then I decided to spend more time thinking about the implications of using data for marketing purposes and how we can do that in a more ethical way. let alone the legal aspect. There are lots of people, looking into the lawyers and people that are expert at the legal compliance. But my interest is more into the ethics of using data for marketing.
It's very interesting. Kind of a similar on my side as well. I was doing a lot of teaching, and overwhelmingly, I would say probably it started about 8 years ago, more and more demand for programmatic. And
Hmm.
so teaching marketers how to do programmatic. And what was interesting is as the more I'm developing curriculum, and I knew how the system worked, I knew it was dependent upon data, but then the more I'm finding, the more I'm uncovering. And then as I would teach it, the majority of people in the room would be very uncomfortable with
Hmm.
the amount and the level of data that was being drawn in without the end user knowing it. They
Yeah,
were putting themselves in the situation
exactly.
and they were very uncomfortable. And these were marketers.
And because now they realize we always say data is power.
Hmm.
But unless you understand the consequences and how it's being collected, how it's being stored, how it can be exploited and used, and so on, of course, there are positive and really good ways of using the data. But interestingly, what you say is also interesting because one of the things I've been asking audiences at conferences for several years, whenever I have the opportunity, is raise your hand if you use an ad blocker. And
Mm.
systematically, there's at least 70% of the room that raise their hand. And they're all marketers and analysts. And I said, well, doesn't it show that there's something wrong in our industry? Don't tell me it's because you're testing or, it's because you know how it works. It's because
Right.
you understand how it works. And you, as an individual, you don't really accept what you try to impose on others, which to me doesn't make any sense. And I tell you, it's systematically, it's about 70%, which is in the general population, the opt-in rate or the amount of people that use an ad blocker is also about 70%.
Mm.
So depending on where you look and which data points you use and so on.
Right.
So as marketers and analysts, we are not more open than the general population. So
Hmm.
that, to me, it tells me something. There's something wrong if we, even ourselves, we use ad blockers, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. And, seeing more and more ways to filter or screen or even stop ad traffic, at the server level, within a company.
Hmm.
I've seen more and more efforts to do that because of the drain on resources, the amount of traffic that's going back and forth. And I think when you have an IT staff that's very competent about what's happening and what's going in and out, there's security concerns that
Yes.
are appearing as well with
Hmm.
with the amount of trackers on these ads.
Yeah, which brings another point also is the interesting intersection between security as we know it in terms of network infrastructure and website protection and so on, and then you have the data protection aspect, which is okay. Once you've collected the data, how do you manage it? Who controls it, and so on, which is maybe a little bit more closer to the GDPR in Europe. And then you have the legal aspect
Hmm.
and the engineering aspect of the tags and how it works and so on. So that intersection of different disciplines is really a challenge because you can't find, I don't think you can find someone in the industry who would master all of those aspects. It's
Right.
impossible.
Right.
So we need, so you have people that have a very strong legal aspect, for example, but they don't understand the technical implementation of the tags and how the data is going through, and what about third-party cookies and first-party and zero-party data and so on. So, and then you have the opposite. You have people who are really, really good at marketing, but they don't understand the legal consequences of what they are doing,
Yeah.
or not fully understand. Right?
That is a great point. And you're bringing up a couple of things here. I want to make sure that our listeners are knowledgeable. So the concept now of zero party data has emerged. Could you
Mhm.
explain, your opinion, and because I've seen you differentiate
Hmm.
from how others are describing zero party.
Yeah.
How do you describe that? Because I found that very fascinating.
Yeah, typically people will say that zero party data is data that the consumer, the user, will give willingly to a brand, which is fine. And first party data is the data that the brand collects themselves. The and it's interesting when you ask the question on LinkedIn, for example, you have very slightly different opinions,
Yes.
which is interesting because it reminds me of the different opinions there were about what is web analytics, and there were so many
Yes.
different answers. But to me, it's all about who controls the data.
Hmm.
So if we take this perspective, zero party data is data that the end user control themselves. So an easy example of that is, let's say that I own a dog and I have different profiles with different brands. So my pet store, where I purchase the food, the pet food, I can just tell them, okay, I own a dog, it's a large breed, and so on. But when I go to the veterinary and stuff like that, then the profile needs obviously to be more detailed.
Yes.
So in those cases, they will build different. So they might collect their own first party data because I willingly gave them the information.
Hmm.
But we end up with different pictures, different profiles of the same dog,
Right.
right?
Yes.
If it was zero party data in a perfect world, and I know there are startups working on that, in a zero party data world, I would control the data. All I
Mm.
would have to say is I grant access to the fact that I own a large breed dog to the pet store, and so on for the other parties that I'm involved with. My insurance, for example, maybe my
Yes.
insurance premium is different because I own a dog. They don't care which breed, they don't care if it's, how old it is, and so on. They only care, is it a dangerous dog or
Right.
whatever, right? But the day that my dog passed away, it's a sad day, and so on. All I have to do, because I control the data, I just remove the permission to access that
Mm.
information. So because I control the data, all of those different parties that instead of building their own first party data and having their own little kingdom, I control the data and I remove the access. So the profile is not there anymore because it's not relevant anymore. So maybe I don't have the perfect. I think maybe it's utopia. Maybe it won't happen. But I know there are startups working on concepts like this.
And I loved it. I love that example because the biggest, I would say, the hurdle, but also what is most attractive about that is it focuses the ownership on the individual.
Exactly.
That I own my data, therefore I control who can see it, what they can do with it, how long
How
they can
long?
access.
Yeah,
As a end consumer, I am the one in control of my data. And
exactly.
I love that because the current assumption in the industry is that everyone else owns your data and
Hmm.
you can't control anything about it.
Well, the only thing you can control is, okay, maybe you have a profile somewhere with that brand and you update your profile. But how many profiles are there about you floating everywhere, right?
Right.
I'm using LastPass or 1Password to maintain my password. I have hundreds of different passwords, so hundreds of different, if not thousands, of different me floating around everywhere
Right.
with different attributes, different
Hmm.
information, and I cannot easily say, let's pull the plug, let's do a cleanup, a spring cleaning. Good luck. You can
Right.
spend
Right.
hours deleting profiles or updating profiles and so on, and it probably won't go very far because it's not manageable.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and those are just the websites that you have an account where
Yeah.
you have taken that initiative to create the account. It doesn't count what might be sitting in a third party, collection of who they think I am and who they think they're targeting based on something that happened 3 or 4 weeks ago or 2 hours ago.
Yeah. Or
And
3 years ago.
right. And then you have multiple companies acting as these data warehouses. So I could have, like to your point, I could have thousands of profiles of what companies assume they think they know about me.
Yeah. And sometimes, you receive an email saying, we've updated our privacy policy. And then you realize, geez, I haven't used this website for, I don't know how long. So it's kind of a reminder. Or the other funny one is, Black Friday and stuff like that. You don't receive any emails all year long. And
Yes.
then suddenly, because it's Black Friday, everybody loves you. Every brand wants to, you're so important. And then you realize that I don't care about that brand. I don't want to be on their mailing list anymore. It also brings me to a point where I don't believe in anonymous data. So that's a strong statement.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is the analogy I do with DNA. A DNA on its own is not worth a lot, right? You have some DNA information and it's anonymous. It's not tied to your name, your address, or whatever. But we generally recognize that our DNA is probably what is the most unique about us.
Right.
It's very, very private,
Yeah.
right? And those ancestry and so on, of course, they make a good use of that. So we recognize that our DNA is very unique. It represents us. It's very precious, and so on. The way I see it is in the depth of the big data swamp that is, everywhere in those third-party data collectors that are supposedly doing it anonymously. There's a unique sequence of attributes that represent your digital DNA, your unique you. It's a unique combination, but it's supposed to be anonymous. But it's anonymous only until someone figure out how to de-anonymize it. And there were plenty of studies over time, like the famous one using just the zip code and a few. I think it was just 3 attributes was sufficient for, and so on and so on. More recently, Mozilla demonstrated that using your browsing history alone was sufficient to re-identify you. I think 15 attributes are sufficient to identify 99.98% of the people, just 15 attributes. And then you see those ad networks, that sit on hundreds of different attributes, if not more, for each individual anonymous person. So I think it's just a matter of science and evolution of the capacity, computing capacity, and so on, in order to reach a point where data can be de-anonymized. The risk is there. It's always there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I even go back to, I think this is in the late 90s, AOL, just looking at someone's search history, they were able to find the person who I think maybe 3 months of search history, and that's all they needed to find that person, and that was in the late 90s. So, yeah, I think the word anonymous now is just marketing speak. It's not. It's something to make people feel better, but there's, as you said, I think the local, it was last name, gender, and zip code, and we can find you, and that's it. But we have IP addresses, we have location data, we have so many things.
If you're a Facebook or a Google, let's take the example of Google. They position themselves as being, okay, a good player. We're going to kill the third-party cookies.
Yes.
And we just said that browsing history, IP address, or in the case of Google, you're almost constantly connected to your account for so many reasons. You own an Android phone and so on. They don't even need third-party cookies. They don't need that. So behind the nice positioning of being a good player, killing third-party cookies, and by the way, I'm using Brave. I've been using it for a long time. It doesn't support third-party cookies. And guess what? Everything works fine. As a
Right.
consumer,
Yes.
I'm happy. As a user, I'm happy. And it doesn't need third-party cookies. So, what I see is those tectonic plates of the Facebook, Google, Oracle also is a big player, Amazon, Apple, and so on. Those tectonic plates are shifting, and of course, each of those players are putting on the hat of being user focused and privacy and so on, but they are building their walled garden while trying to destroy the competition and so on. Of course, they won't say that. There are some positive things. What I'm worried is that we've already reached a point where those changes are forcing innovation, and which is a good thing. The problem is I've seen ad tech and martech players not trying to be creative and comply and be really user-centric and really care about privacy, but taking the opposite direction and trying to find ways to how can we continue to collect even more data in a more sneaky way.
Right. Yes.
And go until the very, very end of the thin line of legality and being compliant. How far can we push it before we get caught and get a slap on the end? And that worries me because the cure might be worse than what initially we're trying to solve.
Right. Well, I mean, we see apps being delisted constantly whose only purpose was to gather data. I think we just see, what was it now with, I think it's Clubhouse, the amount of data that they soaked and then turned around and, we're seeing this, leaked or sold or, and you have to wonder what was the business plan to start with. Now, you've brought this up a couple of times, and I want to come back to this to talk about Flock and Google's attempt, but you have used the words both illegal and ethical when it comes to privacy. So how are you using those? What's the difference there?
It's interesting because, and maybe I'm wrong. I'm always open to be challenged and have a discussion around that. But to me, having a legal approach to privacy means that as a business, you're trying to lower your risks. You're doing everything that you have to do in order to be compliant so that you don't incur any risks. If you take the ethical approach to privacy, what you ask yourself is not, how can I lower my risks? What you ask yourself is, what do my user want? And the simple, most efficient way of seeing that is something that I've been advocating for a while now, which I call no consent, no tracking. Mm-hmm. Under the GDPR and e-privacy, you go on a website and you have those annoying pop-up banners that ask you for cookie permission. And it's so stupid because it's not about the cookies. We don't care about the cookies. It doesn't even have to be cookies. It could be any other way. What we care about is, are you going to collect personal information and how are you going to use it, for which purpose, and so on. So we provide consent. We say, I agree or I don't. And the opt-in rate is very low, and we can complain about those banners and try to find ways to increase the consent rate and the opt-in rate and so on. But the thing that really annoys me is you go on a website, there is this consent banner, and you say no. Guess what happened next? They still track you.
Yep.
They still track you because they decided that they have a legitimate interest to track you anonymously. Mm-hmm. So supposedly there is no personal information and so on, so they still track you. But you just asked the person, do you accept to be tracked? And they said no. They didn't say, I don't want to be tracked, but it's okay if it's anonymous, or it's okay if it's such and such tool, because I see obviously some of the vendors are saying we are GDPR compliant and e-privacy compliant. We don't have to ask permission, and you can just go ahead and track because it's anonymous or whatever the reason. But when you ask the user, they send a message. They answer, I don't want to be tracked or I want to be tracked. They're not, in my opinion, they're not really saying, I love cookies or I don't love cookies, right? That's not the point. That's not the question. And they're not saying, especially they're not saying, I don't want to be tracked except if it's such and such tool, or so on. So I think it's a big lie. It's a false impression of caring for privacy.
If you are a regular listener of Endless Coffee Cup, well, you know I love coffee. If you are listening for the first time, then the name of the podcast should be a big clue. I love conversation, and I think that we have a lot to learn from each other if we only take the time to sit and talk over a cup of coffee. Maybe we'll come to a resolution, maybe not, but at least we've learned from each other. It's in this spirit that I'm happy to announce a regular sponsor of the Endless Coffee Cup, a coffee sponsor. In Care of Coffee is a coffee company that is unique in the market. They are directly tied to the communities that produce coffee and ensure that the proceeds go to the coffee farmers, the local producers, and their communities. There are no middlemen or markups. The proceeds from the sales go directly to the communities that work so hard to bring us the enjoyment of a great cup of coffee. Go to incareofcoffee.com, follow the link in the notes, and use the code ENDLESS to get 10% off your order. Again, that's the discount code ENDLESS to get 10% off your order. I'm enjoying the whole bean Wewe Tenango coffee today. Please support our sponsor and know that your support goes directly to the farmers, producers, and communities that help power us here at the Endless Coffee Cup podcast. Well, as you said, it's companies that are saying we're user centric. The user comes first, but yet at the same time, tracking without consent or assumed consent, and so I love the distinction there between the legal and ethical, because like you, I believe we have a serious ethical problem in collecting data and collecting it just to have it. Even though we may not know what we want to do with it, there's money in the collection. There's money in what can be done with that. And that's not user-centric.
For years at conferences, I heard leading people in our industry saying, storing the data is cheap. Collecting the data is cheap. Let's collect everything we can. Store it somewhere. I call it a big data swamp. Store it somewhere, and we're going to figure out how to exploit that data when we need it, because it's going to be there.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really work. I never believed it worked, but the people saying that were really industry leaders. So it's hard to come against, publicly against something like that. I've done it a couple of times, but it gets me in trouble.
So as we're saying this, I'm looking at my closet over here, and I have a bin of CD-ROMs with log files that I just can't bring myself to throw out right now.
Well, there can be
someday
golden nuggets in there.
Someday I might use that.
It's like the AOL diskettes.
Yes, I could decorate with them. Why would I throw them out? Well, I wanted to bring that up because you had brought up, just that ethical issue, and getting back to differentiating between cookies and tracking and getting into the consent there. On that issue, and I'm going to circle back here on what Google was doing by eliminating third-party cookies, but they attempted to replace that with Flock and the federation learning of cohorts. And to your point, if you're using a Chrome browser, you still got a direct connection back into Google, and technically, by their definition, anything you do on that Chrome browser, they're a first party, even if you're somewhere else. And it was interesting to hear, especially, again, from the analyst community, understanding how things work. The analysts were the biggest critic. And I tend to think this was a victory that they stopped, because I think you saw Amazon said we're going to block it. WordPress, major sites that would affect that. Do you think this is the beginning of sort of a chink in the armor of people resisting Google as the 800-pound gorilla?
Yeah. Well, if we think of Amazon, of course, it's the second biggest search engine, right? They have their own data, and they can use it. And I'm a big Amazon customer, and it's a brand that I trust. So I'm willing to give them a lot of my data if they make a good use of it and they serve me
Right.
better and so on. I wouldn't be really willing to say, oh, Amazon becomes, just another ad network that sells the data everywhere and so on. So I think to some extent, they've done a nice job of keeping a control over that. But yeah, I think Flock is interesting because conceptually, on paper, it's interesting. But when you
Hmm.
start to open up the engine and well, for what we can see, because it's pretty much a black box, uh, but for what we can see is there are many, it creates, one of the things is it creates a new fingerprinting attribute or opportunity. It creates a scenario where your own audience as a brand could be part of a flock group or cohort, which I should say, that would end up being used by your competitor. So there are so many little things that are annoying. And one of the funny things I noticed is that Google decided that they were deploying Flock in testing um, in different locations except Europe because the legal approach to it is risk mitigation. And they knew there was a risk that under the GDPR, there could be an issue, right? So they didn't deploy Flock in testing mode. But the other thing is, they didn't ask the users. They just said, okay, we're going to test Flock, and here you go. It's there. I don't know exactly where in the browser or where on the website or all the details. I don't need to go into this level of details, but what I know is they never asked me if I wanted to be part of Flock as a user. So to me, that's an issue, right?
Right. Absolutely. And that's sort of Google's history is this across the board, this is what we're going to do now, and everyone else has to comply. And so I was kind of cheering on the sidelines when I saw Flock, like finally, people were standing up and seeing even, and I would call Amazon a competitor and a significant competitor and significant enough that this is going to affect Google. And seeing that back down was a real, I think, a victory for privacy. I don't know. We'll see.
As I was mentioning, they are building their walled garden or improving, or, raising the wall a little higher, something like that.
You're right.
But
Right.
yeah, the primary interest is commercial. It's
Hmm.
certainly not privacy.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. We know that. I think with Google that anything they're doing is it's to promote
Yeah.
themselves financially and make that happen. I want to shift gears a little bit
Mhm.
here. We've talked a lot about data and privacy, but let's bring it into analytics and move back to that. You've spent years talking about digital analytics. You've got a model that it's been used by many agencies. You've developed this. Can you give us a quick summary of your maturity
Mhm.
model?
Um, I did that when I was completing my MBA, and at the time, the talk of the town was analytics is hard.
Right.
And I already had some experience working with data. I already had years of experience working with data, and it was not any easier. So my thought was, well, if we always complain that our work is difficult and is hard, how can we expect to understand the business and optimize it and say, hey, we can make recommendations? I was like, eat your own dog food. Do what you preach. If you think analytics is hard, you need to find ways to optimize and improve your own job if you want to optimize and improve the business. So I
Right.
started looking at what are the factors that are the critical drivers of success, because we hear a lot about failures, and occasionally we hear about, oh, this was a big success, and then everybody talks about that one. So I looked at the different factors, and I considered the structure of the organization. What is the actual level of usage of the data, the governance aspect of the data? Then I looked
Mm,
at, okay, what is the objective? And then you realize that oftentimes there's no objective, not at all. So you need to solve that. Then I looked at what is the scope? Are you trying? Oftentimes, what I say is if your job is to manage Facebook campaigns, the scope is pretty limited. You're not managing the whole marketing ecosystem, but you can still do a super great job doing that. And it can be very rewarding to, optimize and improve Facebook campaigns and so on. So the scope is important. What's the size of the playground? And then came, who are the resources? What are their skills and expertise? Oftentimes, back in the days when I did that, there were a lot of people with a marketing background, but very few people with an engineering background, or a few people with the deep understanding of data. They were able to use Google Analytics to get reports and nice 3D pie charts and so on, but beyond that, right? So what is the expertise of the team? And then the key factor, the thing, all of them, there are 6 areas that you need to master, but one of them came up as being the one that was the weak spot. It was, what is the analysis process in place? How do you state an hypothesis? How do you get to do problem solving? Is it your own approach to it? Is it because you've done it so many times and you found a magic recipe that it works for you, but if you go on vacation, then everything falls apart because you're not there anymore, right? And then the last one, probably the thing that was the least important, was what are the tools that you use? And not really the fact that you pay for a license. And remember back in the day, so that was 12 years ago that I did it. So it was all about Google Analytics free versus paid license. And if you use a free product, you're kind of just playing around. And if you use a licensed product, then wow, you're in the big league. But it's not the fact that you pay for the license, it's the level at which you're able to use the tool that you have at your disposal. And that was probably the least important factor, in fact, to have success with analytics. So given all those aspects, I was able to create a rating that would say, oh, you're at level 0 or level 1 through 5. And if you're balanced in all of those aspects, it doesn't matter if you're at level 5 or level 2. If you're at level 2 and it's well balanced, it means that in your role, you bring the most to your organization, and now you can consider pushing further. But if it's all over the place, you have the super great tools, but your analysis process is very, very bad, then you need to fix that before trying to evolve to the next level. So that was, initially it was very, people were skeptical around that. I had comments about, been there, done that, it's not useful. All models, all models are wrong, some are useful, all kinds of comments like that. And it took a while to really pick up, and then agencies started to use it, practitioners started to use it, people got more interested into it. It was copied, it was modified, and so on. And I always said, in order to be successful, it needs to sustain the test of fire. It needs to be in the field. It needs to be used and abused. I didn't make money with it. Maybe I should have had a better business strategy around the model and, put a patent on it or trademark or something. Some other people did. But I think that was a big contribution to the industry. I'm glad I did that. I didn't do it for the money. I did it because it was a challenge.
Absolutely. And like you, I've heard that so many times. Analytics is hard, it's difficult, and it's interesting just training companies. They all have the same questions. What's important? What do I need? How do I get insights? And I'm always amazed that those are very basic questions. And it seems a shame, and I ask marketers this all the time, how many of you have been formally trained as to what analytics is? And we're pushing kids out of university in marketing who have never dealt with any kind of analytics. And so they don't know the language. They don't know, and it baffles them when I train analytics. We don't even start. We don't even go to the tools. Like we're going through the model of what's your purpose? What's your objective? How are you trying to complete that? What's that look like? And it's that self-examination before you even start looking at data.
There were some interesting revelations when throughout the years applying the model with my clients. So I said I didn't make money with it, but I did consulting and I did other stuff. Obviously, I had a good living. So, but there were some things that really fascinated me. When you start a conversation, typically as a consultant, especially, they want to hire you because they have a problem they want to solve right now. But when I try to say, put aside the analytics and the website and those aspects, because I know that, tell me about your business. Tell me about what you do. Tell me why you do it as an organization. What is the big goal as an organization? And it's amazing how many managers had a very hard time describing what they were actually doing as a business. So it was always trying to going back into, we have this problem. We have this typically a data collection problem, right? Data quality. We want to do an analysis of this and that. Okay, but why do you want to do this analysis? Maybe there's something else that would be much better. But no, that's what we want to do. So I actually walked away from some consulting engagements because I felt my role was not simply to answer the question. My role was to enlighten the customer, that my clients, so that in the future they can ask better questions. They can and they can become self-sufficient without always relying on a consultant to tell them the answer. Right? So that it was interesting. I really enjoyed that, and with coaching agencies was a little bit of that also. Trying to make them self-sufficient in their analytics practice.
That's great. I love the example you gave there because you just walked right into my next question, and that was how company culture plays a role in analytics. And I think what you just described there is the culture was we want this answer, but we're not willing to go back and even see why we are here, what has brought us to this point. And then the more you're poking and exposing that there's a systemic
Yes.
problem here.
I have an interesting anecdote for that. I worked with a client that I did because of my computer science background and so on. I did obviously a lot of implementation and developing WASP. WASP was the first data quality assurance tool specialized for analysts. So detecting the tags and saying what the tag is doing and so on. So that was, you go back again about 12 years ago. But there was that client where they were using, I think it was $8 at the time. Mm-hmm. And then, they were using Web Trends. Web Trends, Web Trends is not good enough. We need to switch tool. So, they did an implementation of, I think it was $8. So they switched to Hitbox, and then a year later or so, Hitbox is not good enough. We need to find another tool. And then they were looking at now it was Omniture. We need to switch tool. And at one point, I told them, you know what? The problem is not the tool. The problem is you. You are the problem. You don't exploit the tool, the data that you already have at your disposal. You need to change the way you approach the problem. If you think that switching from Excel to Google Sheet is going to make you a better analyst, well, I have some news for you. The problem is not the worksheet that you use. The problem is how you approach the issue in the first place. So that cultural aspect, the organizational, and the other thing we hear very often is you need to have executive buy-in in order to have success with analytics.
Right.
And it's true, of course, if you're really lucky and the CEO is an ex digital analyst, you're super lucky, right?
Yes.
But most of the time, what the reality is, you can have a top to bottom approach, which is great because there are resources and so on, budgets, tools, hiring people. But at the same time, the expectations are super big. They want to work on very, very big problems. And guess what? As digital analysts, what we're trying to do is to go into a continuous improvement process, work on the
Hmm.
small things and improve them all the time. So
Right.
the top to bottom approach, yeah, maybe it's one way, but the reality is a bottom up approach works also. We don't have to dismiss the bottom up because people in the field, they know what are the issues. And if
Right.
if you've ever worked with business analysts, that's one of the things they do. They try to understand what are the issues that people in the field are facing, so that
Hmm.
it's all about this analytics or analysis process of taking a big problem and trying to slice it into small chunks so that we can understand. When you have a top to bottom, you work on big stuff. When you have to bottom to top, well, you can start with the small stuff and then grow your sphere of influence and take more challenging, more bigger problems, and you can make your way in that direction instead. And that works also.
Yeah, and that again, it kind of depends on that culture. Are we allowing the innovation from within to improve in these small steps, or are we a rigid approach that we're only looking for that to happen? Um, let's. We've got a few minutes left here, Stefan. I'd love to know what is your opinion on Google's new GA4
What a bad name
analytics.
first.
I mean, I loved Universal. Universal made sense. It's collecting everything. Um, I started using this the other day. The other day, I started using it when it came out. I gave up. I'm like, I'm not getting anything I want. Nothing's familiar. I was completely frustrated, and then when I started seeing other analysts express the same frustrations, the same, "What happened?" Uh, I felt so much better. I'm like, "It's not just me. This is
Yeah,
great.
there's
What is
always
Google
that moment
doing?"
where you say, "What if it's me?"
I'm just not catching it
Yeah,
anymore.
I'm getting too
I'm
old.
aging out.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's not the same product. I don't know
Right.
why they kept the name, because it's not the same product. It's a total re-engineering of the approach. It's going from an approach that made its way through the years of understanding page views and events and sessions and visitors or users and so on. And the data model is totally different. Um, so first, I think it's a mistake to call it GA4. From a branding perspective, I think that's not the
Right.
right thing to do. But there's a bigger problem here. Uh, I've been quoted for saying that the simplest definition of big data is it doesn't fit in Excel. People ask me to explain that, and it's pretty simple. It's not about the size of the data and stuff like that. It's because you have to change the way you approach the problem. If you use big data with rows and columns, it doesn't change anything.
Mhm.
So you have to go from, in Excel, it's two dimensions. You have rows and columns. That's it,
Yeah.
right? With big data, you can have all kinds of data structure. And in fact, it can be unstructured.
Mhm.
The problem with Universal versus GA4 is it creates the same kind of mindset shift. You have to go from a mindset where you have predefined reports that have rows and columns, and then suddenly you end up with something that is so more powerful, just like a spreadsheet versus big data. It's so more
Right.
powerful. But you need to re-educate yourself in how to use that.
Hmm.
And in the same way, you go from GA, which was really like an office solution, like anyone can learn to use GA, but it's not true for GA4, at least not in the state it is right now. You cannot take someone like, you cannot ask a secretary or an assistant, I should say. You cannot ask someone who doesn't have a strong data background to go into GA4 and say, oh, can you look at this data and answer this simple question? They won't be able to do it. But you can still do that with GA. So I think that's a major, major shift. And then what it creates is, if you're going, because once again, you have to redo the implementation, right? How many times were we told that, oh, it's, a couple of lines of code, you won't have to touch it anymore, right?
Yeah.
So if you have to redo an implementation because of GA4, my advice is evaluate your needs, evaluate what you're trying to do, evaluate your maturity level as an organization. And maybe GA4 is not the right answer. Maybe it's time to look at other solutions. It's not because it's free that it's the best, right?
Absolutely. Because it has been free for so long and it's almost synonymous with the analytics, I think people have almost forgotten that there are so many options out there that are probably better. And I know that's one thing that this has caused me to do is because Google has a history of killing things. If GA4 goes away next year, I need to be ready, or not GA4, but if Google Analytics to the Universal goes away, I need to be ready for this. And so as website owners and working with other clients, I'm recommending you need to be ready because Google could kill it and not give anyone a
Yeah.
moment's notice.
I think one of the problem also is they've made it the default. GA4 is now the default when you create a new property. And at least when they did it, there were a lot of features. They removed the label beta from it, but there were so many issues and so many missing pieces and so on. It's an insult to the to the analyst community, really, to do that.
Mm,
Like, typically data analysts are eager to test new stuff. They
right.
didn't have to do that. People were
Hmm.
willing to dual tag and test it and learn it and so on, and would probably have been much more open to occasional issues and missing pieces and stuff, instead of Google saying, okay, now it's the default and you need to start doing it now. And just this morning again, I had a message saying, oh, switch your GA property to a new GA4 property. And don't do that. Not now. It's not the right time to do it. So I don't know. I don't know why they did that. And of course, Google has not always been an example of transparency, like any of
Hmm.
those big players. So we probably won't know why they chose to do that. But it's backfiring a little bit, right?
It is. And especially I find in the organizations where I'm doing training, it's marketers that are using Google Analytics. And so to all of a sudden create this data playground, maybe that's what the goal is. It's completely lost on the people who just want to know what was my conversion rate from this campaign on this landing page. That I'm just there to get the
They want
yeah.
to know what's the bounce rate coming from Facebook. Oh no, bounce rate is not there anymore.
Right, right.
We're not saying it
Yeah.
was a good metric, but it was there. That's what was available at the time, and people got used to those metrics. Yeah, so it's going to be very interesting to see how the market is going to evolve between those tectonic shift of the big players, between
Hmm.
the legal aspects and the privacy, and then the fact that different tools are emerging. At one point I was asked if I could only use one tool or one type of tool, or would it be a web analytics solution? I said probably not. If I could only use one platform, and especially now you have a customer data experience platform that offers data collection and all the aspects around marketing and so on, so well integrated and so on, why do you still need web analytics as a standalone product to do that? So the risk is that for Google, a lot of people are using Google Analytics because of Google Ads. So that kind of standalone product, is it really relevant anymore? We'll see.
Do you think that's the future? Is that analytics is going to be pulled in more into, like you said, a customer experience platform, like a Salesforce or, like some of these CRM platforms? As you said, the more, all my customer data is there and their web data is there. What's the purpose of this? Other than to get some real simple metrics, do you see that as the future of what's happening with analytics?
Yeah, and then if all you want are very simple metrics, there are free alternatives, very nice looking and easy to use to GA. There was a whole list posted on LinkedIn. But yeah, I think customer experience platforms, be it Salesforce or others, they have a richness of data that in many cases should be sufficient to do a lot of the analysis that you need to do in order to optimize your website and your business. So it's interesting how it's shifting from, you know what, I think we're going full circle. In the early days of web analytics, I was going to conferences and it was all marketing people. And the way they were talking is that they wanted to get away from IT. They were sick and tired of asking
Yes.
IT for reports and stuff like that. So the way I put it is, for a number of years, let's say 15 years or whatever, marketers were really happy to not talk to IT, go into a nice looking tool, as I said, get their 3D pie charts because that looks good in a PowerPoint. And they were happy with that because they could go there anytime and play around and so on. But now we've reached a point where it's more about data science. So those that are more sophisticated in terms of analytics, they don't go into the GA interface. They go into different tools. They have a different approach to solve the problem. Then it makes sense to maybe have other solutions in place because the data collection aspect is not very difficult. The data storage is very cheap. It's not very difficult. It's the analysis aspect that is more, that's where the value is. So now we're coming full circle because if you want to reach that point, you don't have any choice. Maybe you don't talk really to IT anymore, but you talk to people who have more of a technical background in some way or a data understanding that is more sophisticated than simply going into reports in Google Analytics and stuff like that. Yeah, we're coming full circle to a much more powerful approach, more difficult. I hate to say that, more challenging, maybe more opportunities.
Well, I mean, it's getting into where we were in the first part of the session is as we are pulling more and more data into that centralized view, and the data is more dynamic. It's updated constantly, and now we're back to that legal and ethical aspect of we want to be compliant, but also what are we doing with the data? Do we really need this? How are we viewing the customer and their data? As the systems get bigger and more robust, they're going to provide a lot more information, and there comes a lot of responsibility with that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in the future, privacy is going to become a brand asset, just like caring about the environment is an asset, or equality and so on are a brand asset. Privacy is a brand asset. Right now, it's viewed as something that is a negative in your growth or your opportunities and limits creativity and whatever the excuse is. But I think that's going to change. We're going to see a difference between the brands that are really taking privacy seriously versus those that are still abusing it or neglecting it.
I hope so. I think that would certainly help the industry mature much faster the quicker we get there. So absolutely. Absolutely. Stéphane, thank you so much. This has been just a fascinating conversation. Really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you for making the time to come on today.
Thank you, Matt. It was a pleasure.
And Stéphane, if anyone wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
StéphaneHamel.net, or simply look for me on LinkedIn, and I'm easy to reach.
All right. We'll put those links in the show notes. And again, Stéphane, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And listener, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Endless Coffee Cup. I look forward to seeing you again and talking to you again on another episode.